Hey guys, welcome back to the Results Junkies podcast. Paul and I are both at home, both back in the US, and we're talking about Chrome and what the government wants Google to do with it. We've got some interesting information on a funding model that may work for some of the founders who are listening. And if we have time, Paul and I are going to head over to the pharmacy. Mr. Singh, how are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. It is finally winter in Virginia.
It is.
So I had to break out the jackets, and my boys are so young. Like my daughter's 10, so she's like always, or I guess she's never cold, doesn't have to wear a jacket. But
circulation.
my 2, 3.5, and 5-year-old are all like walking around like, you know that like toddler waddle when they have these heavy jackets on.
Yep.
So I'm glad to see that they're warm when they go off to school in the morning, but I chuckle every morning. I look over at Dana, I just chuckle every morning because they look like a bunch of like, drunk penguins trying to waddle out the door.
Yeah.
How about you? How's everything going?
It is unseasonably cold, man. It is definitely not my favorite for sure.
It was a balmy 24 when I took the trash out this morning.
Yeah. There's ice on a lot of things out there.
How about you? You've been, I guess you were in Vegas probably. I don't even know where you've been lately. Back from Web Summit.
Vegas, London, Lisbon, quick stop in Berlin, all the places. So
I love it. Well, hey, I'm going to Des Moines. You want to come to Des Moines? Let's go.
I do not.
Oh man, well, it's probably warmer in Des Moines now than it is here. So
look at this way, based on how cold it is, it probably isn't colder.
That's right.
All right, so let's take it to Google. We talked a little bit about this last week, said we'd get to it this week. First at a high level, just a couple housekeeping notes. show@resultsjunkies.com is how you email us, questions or comments. He is at Paul Singh on all those social media channels. I am at Pizza in Motion, and you can find us on YouTube, Results Junkies Podcast, and on all your podcasting platforms. So where we stand today is that we're still sort of waiting for final answers, but the DOJ recommendations as part of this large antitrust suit that they brought are for Google to divest itself of the Chrome browser, and there are recommendations, discussions ongoing about Google potentially having to cancel some of their largest contracts. In this case, it happens to be exclusive contracts, and the most popular one there is the exclusive search agreement with Apple for their mobile devices. So those are two separate buckets, and I think they both have different implications. We were talking in the pre-show, first and foremost, about the browser implications, and I figured that would be great stuff for you to share your view with the audience.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the elephant in the room here is that this is one of those really big topics. It's way above all of our pay grades, but it's worth keeping an eye on because for anybody that's running ad campaigns or paid ad campaigns, I would argue that at least 50% of your ad budget is probably going to Google Ads, maybe plus or minus 10%, I guess, but depending on the industry you're in. But the point is, though, is that if this goes through, it could change the way that your ROAS is going to look. So my poorly articulated point on this one is that like you and I have no ability to understand what's going to happen, especially with the new administration coming in. We'll see what happens here, but it's worth keeping an eye on. If even some of this antitrust stuff gets pushed through, you're going to see some big impacts. I mean, this is kind of like what happened when iOS 14 came in. I mean, I remember at the time I was running a consumer business at the time, and when that iOS update happened, I admit fully, I think I even admitted on the show multiple times, I didn't grasp the severity of it. I just thought, ask app not to track, not a big deal.
Right.
Until I realized that, at that time, something like 80% of our paid budget every day, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, was going to Facebook. And once that ask not to track, wave went out, all of our tactics had to change. And so I'm just not going to make that mistake again. And I think it's worth setting your Google alerts, ironically, on this topic and see what happens.
Yeah, I think the browser thing is interesting to me in that I think, to your point, like it won't necessarily disrupt some of the customer behavior. It's sort of like from a customer standpoint, I guess it's the forced elimination of cookies in a way. I would imagine that Chrome could still sell some of that data to Google under this model, because then at that point, Chrome could sell that data to anyone. So it still sounds like there's, data being captured and being able to being able to sell that data, but then Google just doesn't have an exclusive right to it. And I think, like the problem that I have with this, like let's use YouTube as a comparative example. Google didn't start YouTube, they acquired it. So you could argue maybe the government shouldn't have let them acquire it. But sort of like going back to the days of like, I know I'm older than you, but like, when Bell Labs was a big thing, Google built Chrome, and they built it at a time when it was just a different market. I mean, if you remember the days when Internet Explorer was the dominant browser, and before that Netscape Navigator, it's not like Google acquired Chrome. They built it as a product fundamentally as part of their OS. And so, I guess, maybe you don't have an answer to this because we didn't talk about it pre-show, but if Google's required to divest Chrome, why wouldn't Microsoft be required to divest Edge? I mean, it's a big part of what they do too.
Yeah. And look, you and I are not attorneys, right? But the underlying question that I have with this entire thing is I don't quite understand what they're trying to break up. Because to your point, if the idea here is if something they built from the ground up has gotten so successful that now all of a sudden it's considered a monopoly, that just doesn't, I don't know, that doesn't sit right with me. And it's like, hey, you built something that was kind of crazy good, and that's just different than. It's not exactly clear to me what what they're actually trying to go after here. It's like, maybe this is like the first time this has ever been done before, by the way, where like the issue is, maybe the issue here is we've never actually seen a company like this with so many different ways to monetize a seemingly single, like they've got Google Ads, they've got the AI engines, they've got the crawlers, they've got the browser. Like maybe that's why this is so complex. But I'm with you on that, on the angle that you just brought up there. I think that's interesting. It's like, you've become so successful with something you built that now you're getting punished for it, I guess. It just doesn't seem right.
Well, what effect does this have on the ecosystem? Because I think you need to be able, like, I think there's two things that the founder ecosystem needs. It needs obviously the ability for companies to grow massively, because that's what VCs are chasing. And so if you cap the size of a company or split it up, it creates downstream effects. And we've also seen a number of instances where Google has tried to acquire companies and they're not allowed to. And so by not allowing startups to exit to, valuable acquisition targets, we slow that market down, and we slow funding down throughout the stack. So I think that's one thing. And then I'd look at the other bucket here, which is this bucket of exclusive contracts. And I am curious on your opinions on this. So you take the example of Google pays Apple some large sum of money to be the exclusive search provider on the iPhone. And the government may say, you can't do that. That seems to indicate that maybe they see this as a utility, but the phone is a utility. But I'm curious what your opinion is on that.
On what exactly?
On the government saying they can't have an exclusive, they can't pay Apple for exclusive search on the iPhone.
I feel like I'm going to get some like weird nut jobs on the internet that are kill me now, but I don't think the government should be stepping in on that. I think, I can see the argument though. The argument probably is, hey, well, nobody else can afford to pay Apple that much. That may be factually true, but at the same time, like, that doesn't, like, this is probably not the right way to give you an opinion, but let me just kind of throw it out there and see where we go with this.
Yeah.
So I use Safari on my iPhone.
Yep.
I guess just because I've always used it that way.
Sure.
And then I use Chrome on my desktop, my laptop here. I've just always done it that way. I don't know why. I don't know when it happened. That's just how I ended up doing it. And for the vast majority of that I can recall anyways on my desktop, I've just used the default Google settings, right, in Chrome. So it just, you type something into the search bar, and if it's not a URL, it basically shows you Google results, right?
Right.
But probably about a month ago, I switched to the ChatGPT search plugin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to go off topic and give you an opinion on that. My point is that I was able to change the search function because ChatGPT was interesting and I was going to try it. And so I guess where I'm going with this is like, it's strange to me to think that the government would come in and say, "Hey, you guys are too successful," and then the only course of action is to break them up, or the only suggested action is to break them up. Maybe, I don't know, that just doesn't feel right. Why? Because it's not like I, as a consumer, have no other choice. I have plenty of choice. What I
Yeah.
don't have is something more useful than Google yet, and that's where I'm kind of like, I don't know, this sort of doesn't feel right. Why break them up? Because I don't see how this affects me as a consumer on the internet. I can change my search settings, I can use other browsers, I can do other things, and it's not Google's fault that the other options are either not well known or not good enough.
Yes, I agree. And I think to take it a step further, I'd say like, well, like I like to try to think of like, well, what's the knock-on effects of this? Well, if Google's not paying Apple that money, one of two things is going to happen, in my opinion. Apple is going to find the next deepest pocket to, pay them for search, or they're in some way, shape, or form going to try to take on search themselves. Now, you could argue that Apple's more privacy focused, and from a results oriented standpoint, maybe less data gets sold. But doesn't that make Apple more powerful now if they're now gating all of that information inside their company? Like right now, Apple is sharing that information with essentially a competitor in exchange for a large amount of money. And now you're saying, well, now you're telling these two competitors that they can't have that relationship. What becomes of that? And I just don't know. I don't know if there's an efficient enough market to bring other players in to pay for Apple's search that would be beneficial to the customer. And I don't think Apple having more control of search is necessarily beneficial to the customer either. So I'm not sure, to your point, how a customer sees a benefit from this.
That's right. Yeah, it's like I don't exactly know how this affects me. I think, let me rephrase that. As a consumer, I don't see how breaking up Google makes things better for me, in some way. But as an operator, I think it's worth keeping an eye on this because whatever happens here could drastically affect the paid budgets for a lot
Yeah.
of companies. Not just us. We're talking tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other companies that advertise across these platforms. So I don't know. It's worth keeping an eye on. But I would not want to be an elected official trying to deal with this. So, but, by the way, it'd be interesting to see. I don't think this is going to take like a year to sort out, with the new administration coming in what, a month, 6
Right.
weeks, probably.
Yeah.
I think we're going to probably get a pretty good directional idea on which way this thing's going to go, within the next 2 or 3 months, I would think. So
I would think so. And there is still a chance that it all just goes away because the administration has a different point of view. So I think that's part of why we haven't dug in too deeply here, but I think it'd be, be reluctant not to at least mention it. So let's pivot to Snack Bar and this Spark Toro funding model. This has, maybe it's not the same as Indie.vc, but it rhymes with Indie.vc in terms of how it comes together. But essentially, you sent this link over. This is a model, a funding model that, is different than like your typical go to the bank and get money or go the typical VC path and get money. And I'll just hit the highlights here, and then I'll want to hear your opinions. What they say, how the funding model works at a very high level: raised from individual investors, not venture firms, publishers, or government funds. Okay, so we're focusing, really on angels, let's say. Provide enough money that if the first venture is moderately successful, the company can keep going. It's got enough cash to keep going. Where it starts to align with the Indie.vc model, give the founders the option to repay investors their initial sum, after which everyone benefits from profit sharing, optimize taxes, and then cap a founder's salaries at a specific number.
I think more open source docs like this are net good for everybody. And so, maybe full stop, I think it's good. But it's also probably worth mentioning that each one of these kind of additional, or these kind of ideas, also come with a risk, some additional risk to a set of investors that certainly did not really have access to these kinds of deals before. So there is a
Sure.
risk there too, that they could get, that they don't understand the risks that they're getting into. So, but I think the good outweighs the bad here. I think, I remember when we open sourced the 500 documents,
Mhm.
15 years ago now, probably. it was obscene back then. People were like, I remember our attorneys, at least my recollection of what our attorneys were saying at the time was like, well, what about the liability? And we're like, well, we can disclaim that away, with, use on your own or whatever, right?
Lawyers.
And they're like, but what if other people get hurt? And we're like, we're not forcing anybody to use it. We just want to make the paper visible for everybody to look at,
Yeah.
and they can decide what they want to do. And I think ultimately, I'll say now the same thing I said back then, which is like the good outweighs the bad here. The possible upside for individual investors outweighs the possible risks. And so, I think it's interesting. I think like you said, it rhymes with Indie.vc. Those guys started open source their stuff probably 5 years ago now. I'd have to go check the dates, but it's definitely pre-COVID.
Yeah, maybe more than that. 'Cause I think we were talking about Indie.vc on the tech tour.
That's probably right. Yeah. And I think, I don't think, and we talked about it on the show here a couple of weeks ago too. They've relaunched now, but they kind of went dormant over the last couple of years. But I don't think it was because of lack of performance. I think it was really more like money got easy for everybody.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, sometimes it's better to just kind of sit it out and wait. And so they're coming back now. But all that being said, I think it's interesting. I like in this particular one, I like that they're very clear that this is really for individual investors. I think that's really, really clear, because a lot of venture firms can't even use Indie.vc paperwork. I don't think, because the buyback options are kind of like the deal killer.
Yeah, like I wouldn't given this model, I wouldn't be against, if I was a founder, I wouldn't be against having an institutional investor investing as long as they understood the parameters under which they were investing. It's to your point, it's going to break a lot of the rules of most of these funds anyway. I think like when I look at this structure from an investor standpoint, the only thing I can think of that's a potential negative for me is that I do think this makes it harder, obviously, to hit home runs because they're paying me back my investment and then giving me an equity stake. So if I know that option's on the table, if I'm just trying to think globally, like I think about, when you talk about you funded, 2,000 or 3,000 startups, and you reserve money for follow-on rounds, and what your philosophy was for follow-on rounds. I've heard that from you for a decade now. I think that if I think about how I would address this market, I would probably want more bets and on smaller slugs, to balance out the risk, because I don't think the risk of failure goes down significantly. And when I say risk of failure, using this video game example, like if they produce one video game and it makes a little bit of money, but like they never get to game 2, or it takes them a long time to game 2 and they're small numbers, I'm not getting any sort of return on that cash, and I don't have an ability to exit. So my IRR calcs or my ROAS calcs over some period of time just become worse and worse because I can't force it harder. Like it's going to be much harder to sell it on a secondary, things like that, because it's going to be harder for them to get to the size where they would be semi-liquid. So like I think this can be a great piece of the ecosystem. I just don't know that I'd want to put bigger chunks of money into these companies before I really understood how they were performing.
Yes. I think, okay, so a couple things. First off, so worst case scenario, this sort of, so let me step back. Just to set the stage, let's use what we call regular investing docs, loosely use that term of like traditional investing docs versus these types of things.
Sure.
With that in mind, I think the worst case scenario is kind of still the same in terms of that. The worst case risk is you lose 1x of your money.
Right.
Where things start to differ is that now you've got these two other scenarios that could become a problem for you. Number one, you've got this kind of living dead kind of problem where you have a company that might just get enough velocity to kind of stay solvent. But now your money's tied up, and to your point, you can't get it out. It's very hard to get the liquidity that's needed. And, still remains to be seen if people find creative ways to kind of like keep their margins low or their profits low because they're reinvesting in the business, and now the investors are kind of not getting any returns, and the internal rate of return drops and all that stuff. So there is an increasing risk with these kinds of deals where you get stuck. The money's just stuck. It's not growing. It's not distributing. It's just stuck.
Right.
And then that doesn't help when the next risk is you've taken all this risk, you've tied up all this money, and you can't get the big exit that you might need to make the returns worthwhile. I mean, look, I'm not a finance guy per se, but I would say like, the argument here, the counter argument to these kinds of deals, like Indie and even this one, the counter argument to this could be, hey, I can kind of vanguard and chill, right? And pull 8 to 10% growth, in a pretty liquid asset with like VTI or VOO and things like that. So for this to make any sense at all, the possible returns need to be like 3x more, you know?
Well, yeah,
it-
exactly. If you want to attract those sorts of investors, and I think the tougher part, which is that individual investors, angels, they are absolutely a part of the ecosystem and they're a big part of the flywheel, but they don't, they invest on a different set of criteria than VCs or even family offices do. They typically invest in smaller check sizes. So you're just going to need more of them. And I would argue that, and maybe I'm wrong about this, it feels like to me that AngelList today is probably less popular than maybe it was 7 or 8 years ago. Not by some magnitude, but like I hear founders talk about it less. I see them catering to that audience a little bit less. And so when I think about that, it's like, all right, well, if you're going to use this model, where do you find the people to fill the round out? Because you're probably, assuming you're open to it, you're going to get more $5,000 and $10,000 checks than $50,000 and $100,000 checks.
Yeah.
For lack of a better way to put it. So you have to be able to drum up a large number of individuals, sort of like we did with Julian when we ran the syndicate for PointsPath. We consolidated a lot of smaller checks, but that was work, and it was also to the tune of a couple $100,000. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Not sure how you do that for $500,000.
Well, right. Yeah. It still remains to be seen. So I'm going to kind of speak out of both sides of my mouth here. The thing is, like, on the one hand, giving more individual investors more interesting ways to potentially invest their money in terms of structure is probably good. But the counter argument is that, are these companies not good enough for the existing capital that's out there? I know that's a touchy topic because it raises the issues of, inequity and geography and things like that. But it's something that I think people have to kind of at least admit is real, that to some extent there is a lot of money out there already. And it begs the question of like, do companies that take these sorts of deals at the beginning become untouchable by traditional venture later on? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, that definitely could be the case for sure. I think, part of why I think this could have a place in the ecosystem, and I don't think you disagree, I think we're saying the same things. I do feel like to some degree that things are still gummed up in the later stage investing. And I know, like, we bastardize these letters all the time: C round, D round, E round, all that stuff. But I mean, we have a handful of companies that have been in our portfolio now dating back to, gosh, I think 2012, that are worth billions and have not exited yet. Part of it was the correction on valuations in call it 22 and the drying up of cash and all that stuff. And then the economy, like you got all your reasons, but there's this backlog of companies stuck in that sort of last mezzanine area. And it's leading to a little bit of a backup as you get further down the investment stack. And so I do think that, that's going to create different sorts of problems for founders and them to have different solutions, because I do think my guess is over the next 5 years, we'll probably see fewer companies go public than we did in the corresponding 5 years in the previous decade, call it 2015 to 2020.
Yeah. I mean, I think if the point you're trying to make is that there's not a lot of liquidity in the private markets, the answer is wholeheartedly yes. I mean, I'm thinking the point is like,
man, you're doing great. Love it. You're
I'm looking at my LP investments over the last couple of years, and all the GPs are saying the same thing. There's no liquidity out there.
Right.
Now, who knows? Let's see what happens with the new administration, what happens with the economy. Yeah. Interest rates are dropping. Mm-hmm. And a lot of funds are coming up on their 10 and 12 year anniversaries. And we may get to a point where exits are forced. Whether
Yeah.
those exits are forced into the public markets or, flipped into private equity deals, that remains to be seen. But yeah, there's definitely, if somebody could figure out how to get these deals more liquid, I think we'd probably see a flow through effect of some of these dollars coming right back to the early stage market as well. But
Yeah. No, I agree.
yeah,
I definitely agree. And I think in the interim, some folks get out and stop investing. Some angels look for other stuff. And so I think this certainly could be an outlet for other investors who maybe are frustrated with, things that have been tied up for 10 years and they're looking to write smaller checks into something or have a different return horizon that they
Yeah.
want, that they're okay with distributions. So
yeah.
I think we had a few minutes left. Do you want to try and tackle this Walgreens topic?
Why don't we at least just start talking about it? Because I think
Yeah.
it's interesting,
Mhm.
particularly for consumer based founders. But yeah, why don't you tee it up?
Yeah, I'll tee it up. And I think because you and I have some different views. And there was one thing I wanted to share about it that I didn't share with you in pre-show. So the general gist of the article, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes, is this philosophy. I mean, I would think anybody who lives anywhere in suburbia at this point has a pharmacy near them. When I say a pharmacy, I mean a CVS or a Walgreens. So maybe we shouldn't even necessarily call them pharmacies. They have pharmacies in them, but they sell, bottled water and Doritos and Coke and cookies and all that stuff, T-shirts and hats and so what we're seeing is that they've had a rough year financially, and there the article lists a handful of things that have caused some concern here. One is people going online, and then another is Mark Cuban's cost plus drug company as another way that it's siphoning off customers. And it's an interesting bit of the ecosystem here that to some degree online, people pivoting to online is causing some erosion of their core business here.
I think okay, so this is a really tricky topic. This is probably going to be its own episode at some point. But
Yeah.
a couple things. I think one of the reasons I flagged this particular article before we even get to the health aspect is I think more and more articles these days are talking about the changing behavior of consumers, which I think is like a really fancy term that some MBA somewhere is using to categorize or to capture all the different things we all do differently now than 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But that's the first thing that caught my eye on this one, because even I as a dad, the other day I had to take two of the boys to urgent care for a Saturday afternoon thing. They had some antibiotics prescribed. They sent them to the Walgreens that was halfway between my house and that urgent care.
Yeah.
And I just rolled up to the drive-through pharmacy window, said, I'm here to pick this up. And I just left, and it makes me wonder, who actually walks into the Walgreens? And as I think about myself, sample size of 1,
Yep.
I only really walk into a CVS or a Walgreens or something like that if there's a last minute thing that I urgently need. Because everything else I can kind of get within usually a day or two from Amazon, right? It's like, even with the grocery store now, it's like I don't really need to walk the aisles anymore. And maybe this is a first world problem, but I kind of know exactly what I'm going to get. And more often than not, I'm probably using Instacart now just to pick it up at curbside. So I'm not really walking anymore. So that changing behavior is what caught my eye. But then when we bake in the healthcare aspect of this, I think there have been, if you look at Walmart, CVS, and Walgreens, these guys all spent billions of dollars buying healthcare. They wanted to provide direct healthcare,
Right.
and it hasn't paid off. And one argument could be that the business of patient care is different than the business of retail. That's probably the easy answer, but I don't think it's the answer. I think it's more complex. It's like, if I maybe I'm just a sample size of 1, but if my primary care provider, so right now my primary care guy is, on the second, how all the town centers are here in Virginia now?
Yep.
So for anybody that's not around here, it's like, it's kind of like you have these what do you call it? Shopping centers that have 2 or 3 levels above them. And that's
Yep.
where a lot of the doctor's offices are now.
Yeah.
And so right here outside my neighborhood is one of those kind of town centers. And then my primary care is a, big office right above that. If that primary care provider happened to be in the back of a Target, I would walk through the Target to get to them,
Right. Yeah, I would too.
So I don't know. The point is though, is that like, I think, I think this is more a bad set of timing that like COVID sort of accelerated everything, right? So like, I'm rambling. I'm not saying this well, but I think that people think you can just bolt healthcare onto an existing business and it's going to magically work. And that is not true. And I think that's probably why Walmart lost $230 million on their effort. Walmart doesn't lose money. And so,
Yeah.
but I would think that was probably more because they failed to maybe integrate it. Maybe they tried to run patient care as a retail company, and that you can't do. That's really, really hard to do. Let me pause there. I'm kind of curious what you think here, because you in the pre-show, you were starting to share some thoughts, and I think we pinned it down to talk about it in the show.
Yeah. So one thing I would say at a high level, I do think that, what Mark Cuban has done with cost plus drugs is having an effect on, the Walgreens and the CVSs of the world. If folks aren't familiar with it, I think it's costplusdrugs.com. But anyway, if you Google cost plus drugs, Mark Cuban, like, you'll find the site. They're going direct. They're going around pharmacy benefit managers, and they're going direct to the pharmaceuticals and negotiating prices on drugs. And their model is essentially, I don't remember their number, but it's essentially a Costco model. So they say if they can buy a pill for $10, they're going to mark it up 15%. They're going to charge you $11.50. If they then later on negotiate the price of that pill down to $9, well, they're going to drop your price to $10.40, or $10.20 or whatever the 15% markup is. So your price can go down as they get more customers and their unit cost goes down. They're just charging a set fee on top of it. So by streamlining that piece of it, they're taking some customers out of the pipeline for Walgreens and CVS. And to your point about you go through the drive-through, I also think there's a fair number of people who walk prescriptions in and aren't going through that process. I do think, like, where Walgreens and CVS were investing in urban centers, I think in those urban centers, they were able to occupy a niche in between grocery stores and Amazon. So they could carry enough things that people needed locally in a much smaller footprint from a real estate cost standpoint, and accomplish things that way that a full grocery store couldn't in, say, New York City or DC. That just doesn't work in a suburban model. The one piece that I want to touch on, which I thought was really interesting, you hear me talk about credit cards all the time. One of the companies that I'm an advisor for on the travel side is a company called Bilt, BILT. You and I have talked about them a little bit. They announced a partnership, this is probably about 6 months ago. I think it's really interesting. From a consumer standpoint, like, it's definitely valuable and you should take advantage of it. But I think from a commerce standpoint, it's interesting. They have a partnership now with Walgreens, and they do two things. First off is, you get extra Bilt rewards points when you shop at Walgreens, whether you use a Bilt credit card or not. If you just link your Bilt rewards card or if you link your credit card to your Bilt rewards account and you shop at Walgreens, you earn points for that. And that takes care of somebody like me who's interested in points. But the piece that they rolled out, which I think is very interesting for Walgreens, because Walgreens didn't do this themselves, Bilt did it. If you walk into a Walgreens now and you buy something on any credit card, doesn't necessarily have to be a Bilt credit card. If your credit card, if you also give Bilt your FSA or HSA information, it will scan the receipt and it'll say, hey, Paul, these items on your receipt, which could be as simple as things like sunscreen, which is an FSA or HSA applicable product. Hey, these things that you bought, you could actually charge these to your FSA, HSA. If you say yes, Bilt works with Walgreens to refund the purchase to your credit card and charge your FSA, HSA. They're getting a tremendous amount of information and data that they can use in the future. I don't know how they're going to use it. Not my cup of tea. But the fact that Walgreens was willing to enter a partnership like this with a third party, as opposed to saying, we're going to leverage our technology to help you use your FSA and HSA better, tells me that they do seem to be at a point of weakness and they're looking for ways to grow customers.
Well, again, I know we're running short on time, but this is the thing. That the amount of dollars that are available, to your point, Walgreens, you said it was Walgreens, right?
Yep.
Walgreens didn't enter into that enter into that deal with Bilt out of the goodness of their hearts.
Right.
The dollars don't lie.
Right.
I mean, look, healthcare spending makes up 18 or almost 20% of the US GDP. We're talking trillions of dollars here.
Yeah.
So really it's about the flow of money. I mean, just as a placeholder for later, Walmart says they lost $230 million and have to shut down these 51 clinics across their stores, right?
Yep.
How is that possible when just one example would be if you, and for any healthcare nerds, I'm going to use a big average number here. I know it's different state by state, but if you walk into your doctor's office for an annual health checkup, that's worth at least $150.
Right.
For a 20-minute visit or whatever it's going to be, right? That doesn't even count like blood draws and everything else you're going to do. You're worth at least $150 by stepping in the door to that physician. That is probably more than the average check size of a receipt when somebody walks into a Walmart. And the point is, the poorly articulated point I'm trying to make here is I think consumer behavior is changing. Yeah, that's the easy thing to blame here.
Sure.
But it's worth watching because we all still need the healthcare, and we all, like, to my earlier point, if my primary care physician was based at the back of a Walmart or a Target or whatever, I'd probably still go see him, and it would be one extra visit, one extra set of footsteps coming through the store. And maybe there's a chance that I'm walking back out with extra groceries or extra whatever. So I don't know. These failures, I think, are being blamed on, changing consumer behavior, but that's the upstream real problem is something different. I think it was actually business people that failed to integrate two very different types of business. That's what nobody's really talking about yet, I don't think. So anyway, let me put a pin in that. But yeah, it's hard to stomach the idea of healthcare not working in the retail space because the dollars are massive.
No, they really are. Yeah, let's put a pin in it there, and I think we're going to be talking more about this sort of stuff in the future. But for now, I think it's time for you to pack for Des Moines, and make sure you throw a scarf in the bag just in case.
I will, man. I will definitely take a hat and some gloves.
Cool. We'll see you hopefully next week to do the same thing, and I think I'm mostly home between then. I got a quick Boston trip, maybe a quick trip to Toronto, and then a couple of Vegases before the end of the year. Oh, and New York too. It's going to be a busy December.
I think Des Moines might be my last quote-unquote work trip. And then other than that, we're doing Disney around Christmas. So maybe I'll see you down there.
That's because you're insane. No, I don't go to Disney at Christmas. God bless you. I will live vicariously through you. I'll be looking at the wait times and crying softly for you.
I love it. All right, man. Take it easy.
Right. See ya.